yeah, I think I like Haydn. I would have liked having dinner with Haydn.
Hi, and welcome to Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, the podcast where you learn about some of the most notable works in the history of the form from Australian String Quartet musicians Dale Barltrop, Francesca Hiew, Chris Cartlidge and Michael Dahlenburg. My name is Sam Jozeps. I'll be your accompaniment to this podcast. In this episode, you'll get insights on Joseph Haydn and his string quartet in B minor, Opus 33, No.1. Before you hear from Dale, Fran, Chris and Michael, here's a quick take on Joseph Haydn. He was born in Austria in 1732 and died the following century in 1809. Over the course of his career, it is said that Haydn wrote no less than 473 pieces of music, including 20 operas, 108 symphonies, 47 piano sonatas and 68 string quartets. His talent identified early on, he was sent away from the family home at the age of 6 to begin his education as a musician. He was never to return. He did it pretty tough in his early life as a student and then freelance musician, bouncing between institutions, the streets and various jobs. He later found consistency and spent a large chunk of his working life as a court musician and composer for the rich Esterházy family, based mostly at their castle in Hungary. Literally given an orchestra and an opera company for his full disposal, it was here that Haydn honed his craft in composing. And honed he did. During his nearly 30 years in the employ of the Esterházy court, Haydn produced swathes of operatic, orchestral and chamber works. So proficient and committed was he that he is now known as the father of both the symphony and the string quartet, developing the forms with such musical conviction that they remain the foundation of which we consider the forms to this very day. The musicians will speak about it in this podcast, but Haydn's professional life really kicked into overdrive in 1779 when he gained control over the exclusivity of his compositions from the Esterházy family, meaning he could write and publish music purely for public consumption. By all accounts, Haydn seemed to be a really nice, honest, likeable person, a friend and mentor to many, including Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, with whom he apparently spent quite some time chatting and playing string quartets. And for a time, Haydn also tutored a young up-and-comer who went on to write a tune or two, one Ludwig van Beethoven. What I'm keen to understand is this. As the quote-unquote founder of the string quartet, and with so much music that endures to this day, what is it about Haydn's art that makes people enjoy listening to it so much? From here, I'll leave you with the insights from the musicians of the Australian String Quartet.
My name is Dale Barltrop.
My name is Francesca Hiew.
My name is Chris Cartlidge.
And I'm Michael Dahlenburg from the Australian String Quartet.
I hope you enjoy this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet.
You know, it was me, Franny and Michael in front of a bunch of people, and one of the questions, we're being thrown questions, one of the questions was like, which composer would you most like to have around the dinner table? And Franny said Schubert, I think. Michael said Brahms, and I said Bach, but I wish I could change my answer to Haydn. Mostly because I don't think much is known about Bach and his personality, and I don't speak German, so Haydn seems like a fun one, actually. From what I've read and from what I've heard, he's incredibly humble, a bit cheeky, really well-grounded, man of the people kind of guy. Clearly a hardworking, beautiful soul, a genius, someone who was quite religious and, had this spark of wit.
Everyone calls him Papa Haydn, not just because he lived a very long life, but because he was the father of the forms that became so common to composers ever since him. The sonata.
In this context, a sonata is a composition for an instrumental soloist, often with a piano or orchestral accompaniment, typically in several movements. The sonata form is a little different and refers to how a movement is structured, but we'll get into that some other time.
The symphony, the string quartet.
He wrote in the 60s, that's a bit contentious, the actual number, but he wrote quite a lot of string quartets, and through them he really developed the medium. Before that, it wasn't a genre particularly. It had been used, but Haydn was the one who really brought it to the fore and made it one of the most go-to groups for a chamber musician.
These forms that composers took to great heights were all essentially established by Haydn. I mean, he was prolific. Haydn continually delights. I think musicians will always find Haydn to be sort of in the backbone of their repertoire.
I mean, there's so much formula in Haydn, and one can look at that and go, well, that makes it, very predictable. Or it can be really creative, knowing what the boundaries are and how you push against that, or how you create new old, which is what he was so good at.
So Haydn's set of Opus 33 string quartets, the 6 of them, come after quite a long period where he hadn't composed any string quartets, almost 10 years. He was focused very much on writing operas for his position as the resident composer for Prince Esterhazy.
In langen Furchen schreitet dem Zuge flötend nach.
And so when he did return to writing string quartets, in particular this set, something significant had changed. Of course, he had developed greatly as a composer, but there was a little detail in his contract with the prince that had changed. No longer was he required to write exclusively for the court.
So when he worked for the prince, chamber music was born out of the fact that he had to churn out music for the rich kids to play amongst themselves, which is a fascinating thought, that he was writing music for the elite to play in a little room, and that he wrote so many compositions for quartet is so interesting, that he spent all that time honing his craft for decades, literally, and then turns out on the scene with Opus 33.
He was now able to sell his music, essentially, to publishers and to write for audiences. And thus was a turning point in his compositional career. He was almost 50 by this point, but he was now thinking about the wider audience and selling his music.
I find it interesting because, he was so old. And I think he was always a blossoming rose full of creativity. But I think that when he reached this point, I think it also allowed him to explore new things and to evolve the format. It wasn't just sort of parlour music. As the opus numbers go on in the string quartets, they go from being, private little things to becoming, really serious, complex works. Opus 33 is serious stuff. But it is sort of, for me, this sort of period where he, I think, realised. Is that moment when you realise you are actually good at something?
So the Opus 33 quartets, he actually considered them to be new and special, and he was marketing them to various patrons and publishers in that way. And so what we get are a set of quartets that are incredibly fresh, quite spontaneous, conversational, humorous, witty, clever, but also full of moments of beauty and introspection. So Haydn had really kind of taken a leap forward.
Opus 33 No.1.
We chose this one because we were listening to the Opus 33s quite a lot. And I couldn't get past the first one. I listened to them all and I just kept coming back to this one. I find it incredibly engaging and frivolous.
It's a beautiful, beautiful quartet. This is the only one of the 6 in a minor key.
It's very unusual. It's in a very strange key. B minor is almost unheard of for string quartets.
Well, it pretends to be in D major at the start.
And then in the third bar with the entrance of the viola, suddenly, there's a little bit of a question mark around where we're going. And it's not until, I think, the 7th or 8th bar when finally we hit B minor. So he's already playing tricks by kind of confusing your sense of key and tonality.
The key that a composer writes in is hugely important to your mood.
The first movement is really conversational. You're kind of expecting this somber tune or maybe something a bit fast and snappy with an angry inflection, but it's almost the opposite. It's uncertain and, rhetorical.
It is quite a terse, serious mood that he sets up, but it's also full of twists and turns, and you never really quite get a sense of where he's going, but somehow it all seems to make rhetorical sense.
The most fun thing for me is the second violin part.
At the end of each half, I do this ridiculous little passage which just goes like at the end. It just kind of throws you when you're listening to it, going, what's that? Like, what was that for? And it's just, it is humour. I mean, these works were all just written to be played by a group of friends, get together in the living room and, let's play a quartet. And it just encapsulates that fun.
So it's just these little things that make you catch yourself and go, that's nice, or that's odd, or that's quite funny.
As the quartet goes on in time, the roles of the instruments change. But in this one, it's very, what I like to call violin-y. The first violin just kind of goes crazy and lots of moments. But there's also just these little utterings of comedy from the rest of us.
One of my other favourite things is how virtuosic and almost acrobatic these moments kind of come out of nowhere.
The second movement is a furious little scherzo, and that was one of the other innovations of the Opus 33 quartets. He turned to writing scherzos instead of the traditional minuet. He decided to introduce the scherzo because it had a little bit more of a playful character. The minuet was more stately, more graceful. The scherzo was something entirely quicker and cheekier and I guess allowed for more possibilities.
This violent scherzo is bold, it's rough, but also leaving a lot to the discretion of the performers. An odd trio in the middle. It's just a long ascending line that gets longer and longer, and it's kind of the first hint of some kind of melodic melody, and it's just an ascending scale, and then it descends. And then back to the stormy scherzo.
It involves a technique in the first violin part that was quite new at this time. It's what we call barriolage, which is playing the same note across two different strings. So you get a different tone color between the strings, but it's the same note. It's an interesting device that he employs that he will then use again in the last movement.
The third movement is kind of the only reprieve we get after the first movement. We don't get a slow adagio.
In music, the term adagio means played slowly. If a string quartet has an adagio movement, it's a movement that's played at a slow tempo. Adagio can also be an instruction on a piece of sheet music, directing the musician to slow it up a little bit. Or it can be a description of a musical interlude.
We don't get slow lyricism, we get this beautiful, light-hearted reflection of a third movement.
The slow movement is a little bit more of a graceful dance. It's not that slow when you compare it to his other Opus 33 quartets. This slow movement has a nice flow to it. It's very light and graceful and retains some of that scherzo character. But it's just very charming, really charming writing. He also employs the cello much more frequently as the primary voice. And that is something else that we start to hear in these quartets, this kind of moving towards more equality between the four voices. It's not just about the first violin maintaining the melody.
I think as a cellist, I find it an exciting time in Haydn's repertoire. Sadly, early classical wasn't necessarily the period of blossoming cello repertoire. Mostly because, there were still gambas and viols and other instruments, and cello hadn't really come into its own until about this time. And then, of course, from there on you get romantic repertoire, which is very great for cello. But at this period in time, particularly in the writing of Haydn, he's really the first to give the democratic view. So you get much more interplay and conversation and importance across all four voices, which is a nice thing for a cellist, to not just be the boom to someone's cha.
Okay, I wouldn't usually do this, but before we get into the fourth movement, I want to share with you a little deviation that Dale got onto about the art of interpreting works that are hundreds of years old, particularly in relation to instruments. I found it fascinating, and you might too.
Well, with Haydn, it's so important to consider the stylistic practice and interpretation and how we want to approach this period of music on modern instruments. We play on instruments that were made during Haydn's life. In fact, I think my violin was made only 3 years or so after Haydn's Opus 33 quartets. He wrote them in 1781. My violin was made in 1784. But at that point in time, the setup of the instruments was very different. They played on raw gut strings.
So gut strings are the original type of instrumental strings. And as the name suggests, they are traditionally made from sheep intestines. They are known for their complex tone and rich overtones and are still used by some musicians today.
The bridge was lower and flatter, the bows were shaped differently, so the whole style of playing has changed so dramatically. And so this different approach to setting up instruments has completely changed the way musicians played over the years. And so now we are in this very kind of interesting position where we can approach these quartets as modern players, or we can approach them with the mindset of what a musician in Haydn's time might have approached them with. So it's a constant question as to, how much vibrato am I going to use? How much bow am I going to use? Is this phrase a longer phrase, or is it more broken up? Is there more relief? Is there less sustain, or a more gnarly sound that they might have had on gut strings as opposed to our modern metallic strings? So all of these questions come up constantly when we play, particularly the music of Haydn and Mozart. And I think it's a constant exploration. There's never a right or wrong way to do things. It's challenging each other to explore and to find colours and sounds that are convincing to us and hopefully to our audience. And then we get to the last movement. I would say this is one of the most explosive and virtuosic movements I've come across as a first violinist.
The fourth movement is a firecracker.
The first violin part, it's intense. It's full of semiquavers that move at a very fast pace. And there's a real charge, a real drama to this movement that I think is almost unparalleled.
One of my favourite movements of classical string quartet writing. It is so odd. There are these moments that just pass you by and you go, what? Next time we'll do something there. Why didn't you write a pause there? Or why didn't you write a comma there? Or each movement makes me think more and more that he wasn't writing this for concert halls. He's writing this for a bunch of mates to sit down and play together.
It's extremely fun to play. It keeps me on my toes. He's flexing his muscles. And hopefully he had a great violinist at his disposal, because it's not an easy part to play. But ultimately, I think it's quite an exhilarating movement to end this quartet.
It's almost a shame that we can't have a camera in our rehearsal room, because we are having an absolute blast. This string quartet is so much fun.
It's the piece that will bring a smile to everyone's face. It's light and fun and so clever. It's old music now, but it feels really fresh and dynamic, and it's like it was written yesterday.
I don't think there's going to be any doubt how people feel after they've heard this. It's surprising how elevated you feel. It's dry, it's witty, it's clever. And he knows it's clever. And the musicians know it's clever. We love it.
There's something incredibly fresh and incredibly inventive about this music. So I think hopefully our interpretation and the audience experience of the piece reflects that sense of surprise and that sense of discovery.
Yeah, I think I like Haydn. I would have liked having dinner with Haydn.
So how is it that with close to 300 years of music that has come since, we are still so drawn to the music of Joseph Haydn? After hearing Dale, Fran, Chris and Michael talk about Haydn the creator, who not only founded the string quartet as we know it, but at the same time built further upon his foundations using new techniques and devices. As Michael says, creating new from old. Haydn gives us the art and then shows us how it can be progressed. So Haydn offers us both tradition and progression. And also, I really think that musicians feel connected to Haydn. Perhaps we all feel connected to Haydn. As listeners of Western art music in any and all of its forms, it seems to me that we are inherently listeners of Haydn. No matter what subgenre we listen to, his influence is there. Beginning from the age of 6 and in discovering the symphony and the string quartet, and then in embracing his artistic freedom outside of the court, Haydn created music that was accessible to everyone. In this way, perhaps we can also consider adding pop music to his list of discoveries. As Fran tells us, it's old music now, but it feels fresh and like it was written yesterday. So I feel like if we perceive Haydn's musical legacy in so much of what we hear today, whether we like it or not, how can his music not feel familiar to us? How can he not be vital to us? Perhaps it's no surprise that even in his very name, we discover the letters D, N, and A. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. The music you heard in this episode is Joseph Haydn's String Quartet in B minor, Opus 33, No. 1, performed by the Australian String Quartet in 2023, recorded by ABC Classic. You can listen to recordings of this work via asq.com.au or your streaming platform of choice. For every episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, we commission and feature an original piece of music by a contemporary artist, using samples from that episode's subject. This episode's sampler was created by Ghana-based EDM producer Coldhands. Learn more and listen to the whole track via asq.com.au/podcast. This episode was recorded, produced and edited on Kaurna Country, South Australia at the University of Adelaide. The theme music for this podcast was created by Ghana-based composer, producer and multi-instrumentalist Adam Page. Thanks for listening to Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. If the world of string quartets was a Sunday roast, consider this podcast to be your gravy. Catch you next time.